Gentlemen, I do not know whether we shall change history tomorrow, but we shall certainly alter the geography.
These were the words of British General Charles Harrington on June 6, 1917, one day before the offensive to seize the Messines Ridge in Belgium from German hands began. For approximately 2 years, English engineers worked day and night, digging miles and miles of tunnels dozens of meters deep. The goal they had set was to get right under enemy lines and place 19 huge mines that would cause the largest explosion in human history to date. Until the creation of the nuclear bomb decades later, there was no weapon that could compare to the devastation caused by these explosives. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the mine explosions in the Battle of Messines during World War I. The conflict began on July 28, 1914, a few weeks after the assassination of Archduke Francis of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austrians blamed Serbia for facilitating the attack and gave them an ultimatum. This demanded, among other things, the elimination of anyone they perceived as subversives within the country and the power to investigate the crime, violating national sovereignty. If the conditions were rejected, they would be invaded. The Serbians knew that letting their neighbors into the nation was only the first step before a long-planned conquest. Therefore, while they accepted the rest of the impositions, they refused those that implied a loss of sovereignty. But for Austria-Hungary, this was insufficient, and a day later, war was declared. Other Allied countries quickly joined in. The powerful Germany added its power to that of the Austrians, while France, the United Kingdom, and Russia jumped to the defense of the Balkan country. The conflict soon spread to other continents, with the Ottoman Empire, Japan, and the United States also participating in the conflict in the following years. During the first months of the conflict, a large part of the population of the participating countries was eager to start fighting. The war was thought of as a heroic and noble event, where brave patriots would perform great deeds in defense of their country. That, at least, was what military officers told young recruits, many forced into premature adulthood. These men recalled the cavalry charges of the Napoleonic battles of the previous century, where many clashes ended with sabers or bayonets. But war had now changed drastically, and the entire world was soon to understand this. The German army was one of the pioneers in the field of technology, quickly abandoning antiquated combat techniques. Its machine guns, a totally new weapon, annihilated any kind of enemy advance, slaughtering men and horses alike. The artillery pieces, much more precise and devastating than Napoleonic cannons, also tore English, French, and Russian soldiers to pieces. The Allied side suffered a huge number of deaths in the first year of the war due to this technological imbalance. They had to adapt to the new methods of warfare in order to survive. To deal with machine guns and artillery, they resorted to digging trenches. Thus, the conflict became a war of attrition. The combatants took shelter in defensive lines from where they exchanged fire. From time to time, almost suicidal charges were ordered against the enemy lines, but these almost always ended in disaster, with thousands of men swept away by the enemy's bullets. For years, the death toll increased by the thousands while territorial gains were minimal. Night attacks were also used, where soldiers armed with shovels dug tunnels until they reached the rival positions to finish them off there. Related to these offensives, another strategy began to be used: the use of mines. These were not new weapons, having been used in previous conflicts. But during the Great War, their use reached levels never seen before. The Allied forces changed their tactics. Instead of attacking through dug tunnels, they reached the enemy lines and planted the explosives. This had two advantages. The detonations killed hundreds of enemies, but more importantly, they collapsed the trenches. Not only were the combatants buried alive, but also large amounts of equipment and resources, such as weapons, medicine, and food. Both sides realized that mines could give them the advantage in this war of attrition. However, it was undoubtedly the British who took the most advantage of this type of explosive. By the end of 1915, the battles on the Western Front were concentrated in the Belgian city of Ypres. Its dominance had already changed sides on several occasions, and it was even where the Germans first used their terrible chemical weapons. During these brutal battles, Brigadier George Foch, chief engineer of the British Expeditionary Force, proposed a daring plan to outmaneuver the Germans. Explosive mines would be put to new use. Explosives were usually placed 3 to 6 meters below the surface, but they were often discovered by the enemy and disarmed before they could take effect. So the English officer's idea was to dig as deep as 30 meters. This way, the Germans would have no way of knowing what awaited them. The tunnels would begin in the town of Messines, also known as Messines, which was under British control at the time, and would run beneath the river Douve. This dangerous mission would be carried out by the Royal Engineers tunneling companies, created during World War I just for this purpose. Their nickname? The Moles. The objective was to destroy the German positions in the Ypres salient, located on the southern flank of the battlefront. From this position, thanks to its elevation, the Germans could see the movements of the English troops without obstacles. If the British could successfully detonate their mines, this advantage would be eliminated. On January 6, 1916, Foch's plan was approved. According to the officer, it would take approximately 6 months to complete. When devising the project, he used as inspiration the construction of the London Underground, which had been established in the middle of the previous century. For this, the method of kicking clay, also known as kicking excavation, was used. No picks or pickaxes were used, but simply a shovel and the strength of the workers' legs. Vitally, the work was done in complete silence. The sound spread far underground, and the slightest vibrations could alert the enemy of what was being done. This method would prevent the Germans from knowing what was going on. The tunnelers employed in clay kicking were generally young, strong men. Since a lot of legwork was required, tall people were also sought.
You lay on a wooden cross made out of a plank with the cross strut just below your shoulders. The cross was wedged into the tunnel, so that you were lying at an angle of 45 degrees with your feet towards the face. You worked with a sharp-pointed spade with a footrest on either side above the blade. And you drove the blade into the clay, kicked the clay out, and onto another section, moving forward all the time.
This was not a solo job. In addition to the person in charge of kicking the clay, another person had to fill bags with the excavated soil so that it would not obstruct the path. The last role was that of the wagon driver, who drove a small cart with which he carried the material to the mouth of the well. The bags were not thrown away, but added to the trenches to strengthen them. The British tunnelers had help from Canadian and Australian engineering corps. They all worked together to dig the paths where the explosives would be placed. Meanwhile, on the surface, the fighting was as frequent as it was bloody. Thousands of men died every day in the mud of the trenches. The war had extended much longer than expected, both in time and space, since now there was also fighting in regions of Asia and Africa. This meant that many resources had to be diverted from the Western Front, where this ambitious project was being carried out. The tunnelers continued their hard work tirelessly, but the 6 months that George Folk had planned turned into a long year and a half. In parallel with the deep excavations, the British also carried out shallower ones. Some were discovered by German anti-mine units, which led to brutal hand-to-hand fighting between soldiers from both sides. There was no space to use rifles, so knives and bayonets were used, but also shovels, fists, and teeth. Sometimes these battles ended with the accidental collapse of the tunnel, burying the combatants alive. The earth did not distinguish between factions and killed everyone equally, but the British command did not care about detecting these operations, as they served as a distraction from the main attack, which was taking place dozens of meters below. The Germans correctly perceived the beginning of an offensive in the tunnels they found. They knew that if they succumbed to this onslaught, they would be in serious trouble, as their defenses were designed to counter frontal attacks only. Some German officers recommended moving the vanguard to the second defensive line, but others were opposed, arguing that the strength of the English attack would come from artillery barrages rather than mine detonation. Moreover, as many of the surface tunnels had been found and neutralized, it was felt that the British had failed in their mission. To these men, the Allied attack would consist of an infantry assault with no prior demolition. The British decoy had worked. The tunnels were only completed in mid-1917. They consisted of 8 kilometers of narrow passages, with the entire weight of the earth resting on the diggers. When they knew they were under enemy lines, the British began the second phase of the work. A total of 21 mines were planted under the German lines at Messines. Altogether, they amounted to about half a ton of explosive material. To ensure the element of surprise, many of the Allied units were not notified of the operation. However, they were all ordered to be ready to begin the offensive. At 3:10 a.m. on the 7th of June 1917, the British pressed their detonators. All 21 explosives ignited almost simultaneously, turning Messines into a complete and utter hell.
It was an appalling moment. We all had the feeling it's not going. And then a most remarkable thing happened. The ground on which I was lying started to go up and down, just like an earthquake. It lasted for seconds, and then suddenly, in front of us, the Hill 60 mine went up.
Thousands of Germans were standing just above the mines. For them, the war was over in an instant, along with their lives. But a large number of soldiers survived the initial explosions. Their agony was even longer. Tons of earth and debris kicked up by the mines flew into the air and fell back on them, burying them while they were still breathing. In just 5 minutes, more than 10,000 German men were pulverized or buried by the British attack. The first mine detonated left a crater about 130 meters in diameter. Some British soldiers were even hit by the explosion. The rest detonated within 20 seconds of each other. The explosion was so loud that it was said that the roar could be heard in distant cities such as London and Dublin. Even in France, some thought that an earthquake was occurring. But this was not a catastrophe caused by the forces of nature. It had been caused entirely by the hands of man. Immediately after the explosions, the English artillery began to fire on the already depleted Germans. Both explosives and chemical weapons fell, sowing even more chaos among their lines. This was followed by the charge of 9 divisions, with approximately 80,000 men. The German defenses that survived the detonation of the mines tried to stop the advance, but their efforts were in vain. In just 3 hours, the Messines Ridge, the main objective, had been captured. The enemy had lost its advantageous position and was now in retreat, with tens of thousands of casualties, both dead and wounded. Despite this initial triumph, the battle continued for 7 more days. By June 14th, the last soldiers of the German Empire had been driven from the area, giving victory to the Allies. British morale was raised, while German morale, seeing so many men disappear in such a short time, collapsed. But as impressive as these explosions were, the war was far from won. Battles in this area continued without decisive results until almost the end of the war. The British generals, emboldened by the enormous amount of death and destruction caused by their successful plan, began to think that the war could be won right there at Ypres. But the land here was easily flooded, which caused the terrain to become muddy. This made attacks very difficult to carry out, as the movement of men and tanks was extremely difficult.
The conditions were hopeless. The mud was almost ankle deep. And if you dropped down with your rifle, you'd find out your rifle was useless with mud.
The Germans, in turn, quickly learned their lessons. After this battle, they began to abandon trenches and adopt the construction of concrete shelters, much more resistant to explosives and artillery. This, combined with English stubbornness, caused tens of thousands of Allied soldiers to lose their lives in useless offensives against the new German defenses. By trying to end the Great War once and for all, they only managed to postpone it much longer at a very high cost. At the time they occurred, the Messines mines were the largest explosions created by man. Approximately 10,000 men died in just a few minutes. Even so, this battle is overshadowed by other battles that took place in the First World War, such as those of the Somme and Verdun. This, rather than overshadowing what is told in this video, should give an idea of how terrible this conflict was, where the advancement of technology provided new and deadly ways to kill. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, which of the new weapons of World War I do you find most interesting? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.